We are going to be in John chapter 18. John chapter 18 this morning. Again, if you don't have a Bible with you, feel free to follow along using that handout inside your bulletin, or there should be a Bible in a seat pocket somewhere near you if you'd like to use that as well. John chapter 18. And it's good to see those of you who have been traveling. I know many of you have been on vacation. I know we have several of our folks that are gone this week, and this is just kind of that time of year, but I hope that for those of you that have been traveling, you had a good time. For those of you that are going to travel, I hope you do have a good time, and enjoy some time together with your family, and get to take a breath for a few days here before school starts in just a few weeks. And all the kids were so excited about that, right? It's almost time. But John 18, we have been working through the Gospel of John for almost a year now, okay, going verse by verse through this book, and we are kind of now nearing the climax of the story. For the past several months, we've been looking at one night of Jesus' life. This is the last night before Jesus would go to the cross to die, and he spends between chapter 13 to chapter 17 alone in a room with his disciples. It's called the upper room, and for the past several months, we've been working through Jesus' final instructions to his disciples. The last 3 weeks, we looked at the final prayer Jesus offers. It's the longest prayer ever recorded by Jesus in Scripture in John 17, where he prays for himself to be glorified, he prays for his disciples to be sanctified, and he prays for us, the church, to be unified. And in John chapter 18, we find ourselves, Jesus leaves the upper room, and the story progresses. Okay, he's now headed into a place called the Garden of Gethsemane. So John chapter 18, let's start reading together in verse number 1, and we'll see what God has for us from this passage. Verse 1 says, "When Jesus had spoken these words, he went forth with his disciples over the brook Kedron, where was a garden, into the which he entered and his disciples. And Judas also, which betrayed him, knew the place, for Jesus ofttimes resorted there with his disciples. Judas then, having received a band of men and officers from the chief priests and Pharisees, cometh thither with lanterns and torches and weapons. Jesus therefore, knowing all the things that would come upon him, went forth and said unto them, Whom seek ye? They answered him, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus saith unto them, I am he. And Judas also, which betrayed him, stood with them. As soon as he had said unto them, I am he, they went backward and fell to the ground. Then asked he them again, Whom seek ye? And they said, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus answered, I have told you that I am he. If therefore ye seek me, let these go their way, that the saying might be fulfilled which he spake, Of them which thou gavest me have I lost none. Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it, and smote the high priest's servant, and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Then said Jesus unto Peter, Put up thy sword into the sheath. The cup which my Father hath given me, shall I not drink it? I don't know how many of you like to be in control. I am a little bit of a control freak, okay, not to the point where I feel like I'm crazy, but I like to be in control, okay? I don't know how many of you guys fly a lot. I fly a reasonable amount. I try not to. I don't love flying. Some people just love the feeling of being up there and not thinking about anything. For me, I think about everything. Okay, this is snapping, this is crackling, this is popping, this is the Rice Krispie treat commercial in an airplane. Okay, this is all, everything is going bad, everything that's making a noise. I'm not sure if it's supposed to make a noise. Turbulence, for me, I become like a little 4-year-old girl. Okay, I just don't like it, and I freak out. And then I always remind myself, okay, whenever I'm going through those moments of nervousness, I remind myself of two things. One, don't look like a wimp, okay? No one around you should know that you're going through this anxiety attack. And number two, I remind myself of this stat that I heard, which I don't know if it's true or not. If it's not, don't tell me, okay? That you are like 500 times more likely to die in a car than you are in a plane, okay? So I was reminding myself, you drive all the time, dude. Like, it's cool. You drive your car. You never get scared. You never get nervous when you're driving and you hit a pothole. You don't freak out. So don't freak out, okay, over these bumps. Well, why are we more nervous in that scenario than we are in our car? For me, it's because I'm not in control, right? In the car, I'm behind the wheel, which is laughable, okay? In a plane, who's in the cockpit? A professionally trained, okay, pilot who's gone through years of training and all of these different things to be licensed to fly this airplane. Who's in control in my car? A guy that drove around a block and made 3 right turns into the parking lot and they handed me a license, right? Those are my qualifications versus his qualifications. But for some reason, I trust myself and my limited training significantly more than the professionally trained pilot in this airplane. Why? Because we like control. I want to be the one who makes the mistake, right? I want to be the one who can see what's happening. I want to be the one who's in control. In this passage, we see ultimately that Jesus is the one who's in control. But we're going to see a few different people that have control issues, and we're going to see how Jesus deals with them. We're also going to see how Jesus deals with the betrayal from his friends. So remember, at this point in John 13, Jesus told us that the devil had already put in the heart of Judas Iscariot to betray Jesus, and now that betrayal is coming to fruition. Okay, that betrayal is now coming true. But at no point does John ever want us to imagine that God's plan is being threatened by Judas's betrayal. At no point are we supposed to be nervous about whether or not Jesus is going to accomplish the reason for which he came. That John is going to reassure us through this passage that Jesus is the one who's in control. Judas isn't calling the shots. The high priest isn't calling the shots. Pilate won't be the one calling the shots. Jesus is in control. Jesus' plan is being enacted. He shows us that even at a great personal cost, Jesus is faithful. What I hope we walk away from this morning is this understanding that Jesus faithfully followed God's saving plan despite unfaithfulness all around him, and he actually died in order to save those unfaithful people. So we're going to look at betrayal in 3 stages, okay? 3 chapters within this one chapter of betrayal, and we're going to see how Jesus walks through it in a faithful way. Okay, so number 1, the first scene we're going to see is the betrayal in the garden. Betrayal in the garden. Verse number 1, we see Jesus leaving with his disciples from the upper room to go up into the Mount of Olives outside of Jerusalem. And as we look at this scene, it's helpful to remember, okay, bring back to your memory the first time the Lord has been betrayed in the garden, right? All the way back in Genesis chapter 3, our first parents, our great-great-great-great-great-great-grandparents, right? Adam and Eve chose to believe a lie that God is not for us, but against us. And in an effort to protect themselves, they made themselves equal with God, and what happened? They neutralized God's influence over their lives. It's an act of rebellion, the rebellion in the garden. That rebellion, that betrayal led to you and I needing forgiveness of our sins. It led to you and I being cast into a position of damnation and condemnation because of our sin, that we're now in need of forgiveness from God because of that betrayal. But we should be thankful this morning that God didn't just cut us off. After Adam and Eve's betrayal, he could have just cut us off, cut humanity off, as would have been his right. But instead, he put in place a plan to save us, an unfaithful people, a betraying people. He set in plan in order to redeem us. It is that plan that is now coming to fruition. You remember over and over again through the Gospel of John, we've heard a phrase, "It is not yet my time. My time has not yet come. My time has not yet come." At this point, we see Jesus saying, "My time is come. This is the reason for which I came. This is the fulfillment of the purpose of God from the Garden of Eden. Now is the time for this to be enacted." Now, this was the Bible says, a common place for them to gather. Verse number 3 says Judas knew where Jesus would go. This is kind of like a spot where Jesus and the disciples would go to pray, to spend time together. And it's not like Jesus was hiding. It's not like Jesus said, "Okay, they're going to come find me. Let's go find an underground railroad. Let's go find an abandoned house and hide out in there." He says, "No, let's go to our favorite spot and let's spend some time together. Let's go exactly where Judas would know where we are going." Who's in control? Jesus is in control. He's not hiding. He's not cowering. He's not trying to deceive. He goes right where Judas knew where he would go. And in verse number 3, we see that Judas has procured this band of men from the high priests and from the Pharisees to come and to get Jesus. It says they come with lanterns and torches and weapons. You got to get the picture in your mind from movies or television of this band going into the night, right? I get the vision of Beauty and the Beast as they go to Gaston and the men, right? They're kind of going to that's my theology, is that level of Beauty and the Beast. But you got to get that picture, right? They got the porches, the forks, pitchforks, pitchforks and torches, all right? They got both of these things, right? And they're going towards the Garden of Eden. This is Judas's time of betrayal. But it says also they did it under the cover of night. They knew what they were doing was wrong. We'll see next week through their trial that they're doing this all in a really shady, really suspicious, really backdoor kind of way. Nothing is being handled correctly, and they're moving forward. Now, Jesus had entered into the city a week ago as a hero. A week ago. Now it seems like a long time ago for us because this was 5 months of sermons ago, but a week ago, right? Jesus had entered into the city of Jerusalem and they were applauding him. They were cheering him. The crowds of the general population were celebrating him, but the religious leaders saw that moment as a threat. They saw that moment as, look at all of these people. Look at the masses of people that are celebrating him. We've got to deal with this issue. Why were the Pharisees upset with Jesus? We've seen it over and over again through the book of John. He was proclaiming the kingdom of God in a way that they weren't necessary, in a way that didn't depend on their rules, in a way that didn't depend on their legalism, in a way that didn't depend on their religiosity. Jesus was saying, you don't need this stuff, right? You don't need to follow after these men. These men are actually perverse teachers. They're trying to gain their own popularity. They're trying to pad their own pockets, right? They're trying to do their own good. And Jesus says they're unnecessary. So as any good cult would do, they need to protect their own self-interest, right? So they've now got this mission to go forward to arrest him. The religious leaders have been looking for a way for weeks to arrest him, to trap him. At one point, they sent their lawyers, right, to try and trip him up, but they couldn't do it. So they decided they needed an inside man. And Judas was there, ready and waiting to be their betrayer. At this point, his own sinful and selfish ambition have really squeezed out his ability to be able to see Jesus for who he was. Judas never got it. Judas never saw Jesus. Judas never understood who Jesus was. He was so filled with pride, so filled with his own selfish ambition, so filled with his own desires that he never got it. It was just as Adam and Eve's vision of God's goodness and truth was clouded by what? By their own pride, by their own self-ambition, by their own, we want to be like God, right? God's trying to cut us out. No, we want to be like him. No, it's our own pride, it's our own desires of our own heart that clouds our judgment. So in the garden, they came for Jesus. This was their attack move. They had laid a trap, right? And Jesus walked into it, they think, unsuspectingly. Oh, we got him. We knew he'd come here, right? We knew he'd show up. Let's all get the army guys. Let's wait for him in the garden because I know that's where he's going to be. And what does Jesus do? He walks right into it, right? Walks directly into it. They think they catch him off guard. Jesus, look at verse number 4. Therefore, knowing all things that should come upon him, went forth. They didn't catch Jesus off guard. Jesus isn't a mouse in a mousetrap. Jesus knew exactly what was taking place. Jesus knew who would be there. Jesus knew Judas would be there. Jesus knew why these guys were there. He completely understood it. John wants it to be very clear for us. Jesus was not caught off guard. Jesus is never caught off guard. He is not having to adjust his plan. This isn't plan B. Oh no, they showed up in the garden. Oh no, they're coming to take me. Let's shift the plan really quick. Let's change this. No, this is plan A. This has always been God's plan. This has always been God's control. This is the plan. I think that explains so much about verses 4 through 9. They thought they had this upper hand to take down Jesus. We've surprised him. We've caught him off guard. We've got the betrayer. We've got the pitchforks and the truth. Peter is blowing up, right? Peter just can't handle it. He is caught off guard. He's scared. He pulls out his sword and he decides to respond with force. And he cuts off this dude's ear, okay? The guy named Malchus. What happens after he cuts off Malchus's ear? He's rebuked by Jesus. Look at verse number 11. Put up thy sword into the sheath. The cup which my Father hath given me, shall I not drink it? Jesus' rebuke is not, dude, calm down. Jesus' rebuke is theological, not strategic. He's not saying, dude, don't get out your sword. We're outnumbered, okay? He's not saying, don't fight them. There's too many of them. It's a better strategy to live and fight another day. No. Why did he tell Peter to put his sword up? Because of his purpose that he was there. He said, put it up because I'm here to drink the cup of my Father's wrath. He's not saying, oh no, let's all live to fight another day. He's saying, no, Peter, that's not the plan. The plan is for me to go with them. Let's fulfill the plan. Notice the source of the plan. Look at verse number 9. Sorry, verse 11. It says, the cup which my Father hath given me. The source of this plan is the Father. And then he says this. He says, we shall not drink the cup. Okay, the cup, You hear that phrase, you think that's kind of a weird thing. What is the cup? Okay, the cup in Scripture is a common reference to the wrath of God against sin. We'll sing songs about how Jesus drinks the cup of God's wrath, right? He drinks it to its completion. That is the cup of God's punishment upon sin. Jesus is telling us the Father has given that cup to the Son to drink. And if Peter keeps chopping dudes' ears off, we're not going to be able to accomplish the plan. So put your sword up. I know I'm being betrayed. I know this isn't going how we want it to go. I know this isn't how we thought it would be or how you thought it would be, but put it away. This is the plan. I am fulfilling my Father's purpose. The betrayal begins in the garden, and then it continues. Secondly, we see first betrayal in the garden. Secondly, we see Jesus betrayed in his religious court, in the religious court. Look at verse number 12. Verse 12 says, Then the band and the captains and officers of the Jews took Jesus and bound him and led him away to Annas first, for his father was father-in-law to Caiaphas, which was the high priest that same year. Now Caiaphas was he which gave counsel to the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. So as we kind of get into the meat of this next scene in this story, it's helpful to know a little bit of the background. Okay, who are these dudes? We get their names. What's their background? Annas, okay, we're going to see his name listed several times here. Annas is a former high priest, okay? Annas used to be the high priest of the Sanhedrin, which would have been the ruling religious body. He's also the father-in-law of the current high priest, okay? So Caiaphas is the current high priest. Annas used to be the high priest, and he's the father-in-law of the current one, okay? If we look at verse number 19, John calls Annas the high priest, okay? Verse 24, it refers to Caiaphas as the high priest. So the question is, you read this, who's the high priest, right? After Annas finishes questioning Jesus, he sends him along the way to Caiaphas, the high priest. What's going on? Okay, well, it's pretty simple, actually. The Jews would have seen the role of the high priest as kind of like a lifetime appointment, like how we have the Supreme Court justices, right? That you appoint them and then they're there forever. That's how they viewed the high priest. But the Romans regularly appointed and removed their approved high priest, okay? So there was the high priest that the Jews would put in there until he dies, and then the Romans would be like, we don't like that one too much, let's put in a new high priest. So they were all kind of connected to Annas. Annas isn't technically the high priest according to Rome, but according to the Jews, he still had the position, okay? He still had the authority. He's the wise father-in-law, okay? So the Jews go to Annas. Annas sends him to his son-in-law, Caiaphas, okay? So who's the high priest? Kind of both, okay? Both of them are. So he questions Jesus, verse 19, about two things. Bounce out of verse 19. He questions him about his disciples, it says, and of his doctrine. It says, the high priest then asked Jesus of his disciples and of his doctrine. Jesus answered him and said, I have spoken openly to the world. I ever taught in the synagogue and the temple, where the Jews always resort, and in secret have I said nothing. Why askest thou me? Ask them which heard me what I have said unto them. Behold, they know what I have said. On the first pass, okay, Jesus is taking the high priest, and he's taking before this religious ruler, and it seems like he's being kind of dodgy. Like, I ain't telling you what I did. I'm not telling you what I said. You can go ask other people what I said. But he's not being weird. He's not being sketchy. He's not being dodgy. What he's doing is he's calling out the hypocrisy that is all around him. Okay, see, if Annas and the crowd that surrounded him, they were violating several laws, several Roman and Jewish laws. They weren't even supposed to be having this trial at night. We'll see more about that next week. Unless there were some really weird special circumstances, and Jesus' case wouldn't have even come close to making the cut for these weird special circumstances. In addition, those accusing Jesus should have not been able to question him directly. They are supposed to establish the charges against a person by bringing witnesses, right? It's kind of like our court system works today. Bring people to prove your case, but they're going right at Jesus. So Jesus responds to their questioning not by indulging their betrayal, but by calling them on it. He says, there are all kinds of witnesses. Bring some witnesses, right? Do this the right way. Bring the people. I've not been secretive, okay? There's plenty of people who've heard me speak. There's plenty of people who heard me preach. There's plenty of people who have seen my miracles. Why don't you bring some of them in instead of trying to do all this with you on me, okay? With 30 on one, let's handle this the way it's supposed to be handled. Jesus is pointing out the lacking of their good procedure. Okay, verse 22, he continues. It says, when he had thus spoken, one of the officers which stood by struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, saying, answerest thou the high priest so? Like, is that how you talk to the high priest? Jesus answered him, if I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil. But if well, why smitest thou me? Again, Jesus is pointing to their procedure. If he was being offensive, there was a way to handle it in their judicial system. And it wasn't to smack the guy across the face, right? The way they were supposed to handle it, if they were being disrespectful to the high priest, you're supposed to file a statement. You're supposed to testify. But instead, they mock and they abuse. They deceive and they hide. And the contrast between these high priests and Jesus, our high priest, could not be clearer in the way they're treating him. I think it's striking that John 17, the passage we just finished over the past few weeks, is referred to as the high priestly prayer. Jesus stepping into the role of the high priest, mediating between God and his people, pleading with God on our behalf that he wouldn't lose us and that he might take us to heaven. He's praying for us as our high priest, what the high priest is supposed to do. And yet in John 18, the official high priest, the real high priest, okay, at this point, makes a mockery of the office, makes a mockery of the role. What is this? What is happening? Jesus is being presented to us as God's true high priest, as God's faithful high priest. He is the one that's committed to the utmost to God's plan. And those who are now bearing the title are betraying their calling, but they're also betraying the Lord. Now, I think there's a lot of points of application to this. The most obvious one is that betrayal and disappointment and failure are possible even among religious people and even among religious leaders and pastors and teachers and ministers, that there is a real possibility of religious betrayal. Even in a church that you love, which I hope this is the one that you love, right? Your pastors, your leaders will disappoint you. I promise it. If I haven't done it yet, I'll do it tomorrow. Okay, we will. We will disappoint me. We want to love and we want to serve faithfully, but we will always fall short. But Jesus never falls short. He is always faithful. He never fails. He never betrays. Some of you have been hurt by ministers and pastors and leaders and those in church leadership. You need to know that those hurts can be very real and Jesus still be true. Too often we get turned off by a betrayal of a religious leader, or get turned off by the betrayal of a pastor, and all of a sudden, well, if he's like that, then Jesus can't be faithful. In this passage, this is the most powerful religious leader in all of Israel, who is making a buffoon of himself, who's making a mockery of his office, making a mockery of his call. He's slapping the guy that's being accused. He's doing all this at night in a shady way. Yes, it is betrayal. Yes, it is wrong. Yes, it is wicked. Jesus is still true. Jesus is still faithful. Jesus is still fulfilling his plan. You can be betrayed by religious leaders and Jesus still be true. In this text, Jesus never loses sight of his purpose. What's his purpose? To live and to die for our sins. So even when you've been betrayed, even when you've been disappointed by a religious leader or by a friend, Jesus will not lose sight of you. The betrayal begins in the garden by his disciple, Judas. It extends to a religious court where Jesus is betrayed by the one who should be interceding for him. Jesus is a faithful Jew. The high priest represents him before God, just like he would represent anybody else. This is his pastor, okay, his leader, his spiritual, supposed to be his spiritual leader to look up to, and he's the one who's betraying him, and yet it will continue even to get more personal. Look at verse number 15. It says, Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. That disciple was known unto the high priest and went in with Jesus under the palace of the high priest. But Peter stood at the door without. Then went out that other disciple which was known unto the high priest, and spake unto her that kept the door, and brought in Peter. Then saith the damsel that kept the door unto Peter, Art not thou also one of this man's disciples? He saith, I am not. And the servants and officers stood there, and they made a fire of coals, for it was cold. And they warmed themselves, and Peter stood with them and warmed himself. Verse 25 continues the story. It says, And Simon Peter stood there and warmed himself. And as he did, they said unto him, Art not thou also one of his disciples? He denied it, said, I am not. When Jesus was transported from the garden to Annas' house, a lot of people kind of disappeared. A lot of people fell away, but not Peter and this other guy. Okay, I love how we get another disciple. We don't never get his name. Okay, most people think it's John, because John never refers to himself in the Gospel of John. But Peter and this other disciple, okay, are following close to Jesus as he's taken to the high priest's house. We're invited to admire them, kind of, I think, because everyone else left and they stuck around. So it's like, yay, you guys, right? Like they stuck around for like 5 minutes, but they won't stay for long. As they enter, Peter finds himself faced with a shockingly similar situation to Jesus only a few moments earlier. As Jesus stood in the garden, Jesus said, who are you seeking? They said, Jesus of Nazareth. What did he do? He stood firm upon his feet and said, what? I am he. Peter is faced with most commentators think is a teenage girl. In verse 17, the servant girl at the door said to Peter, aren't you one of this guy's disciples too? Well, Jesus stood in front of a band of soldiers with pitchforks and torches and manned up. Surely Peter can stand up to a teenage girl, right? Surely he can stand up and admit that he's a follower of Jesus. What does he say? He says, I am not. It's striking. Jesus betrayed in the garden. Jesus betrayed by his religious leaders, and then Jesus is betrayed by his friend. The language he uses. Jesus, I am he. Peter, I am not. I'm not. Verse 25, as he's standing there warming himself, you're also one of his disciples, aren't you? He said, and I am not. And then a third time, verse 26, one of the servants of the high priest, being his kinsman whose ear Peter cut off, you cut off my buddy's ear, I think I'd recognize you, right? Saith, did I not see thee in the garden with him? Peter then denied him again, and immediately the cock crew. There's a lot more that we can deal here, but I'm running out of time. And we'll revisit some of Peter's story here in a few weeks as he's kind of redeemed from this. The Lord graciously restores Peter at the end of the story. But at this point, I want to make this clear. Okay, even the betrayal in Jesus' closest friends is not able to derail the faithfulness of God. The betrayal by one of his three best friends on the planet, right? Peter, James, and John went everywhere with Jesus, and he is betrayed by that level of relationship. It was not able to derail the saving love and plan of God that Jesus actually was accomplishing through their betrayal. And what's most kind of powerful to me about this story, and I'll end with this, is that Jesus is going to die for those who betrayed him. We looked at this a few weeks ago when Jesus washed his disciples' feet, and we looked who else was in the room, and it's Judas, and Jesus is wiping his betrayer's feet. And we think that's shocking, right? That Jesus would wash the feet of his betrayer. Jesus does far more than wash the feet of his betrayer. Jesus dies for his betrayers. It's easy for us to look at Peter, and I do it jokingly all the time, and we do it seriously all the time. I think, what a doofus. Like, a teenage girl, like, we get the soldiers at the fire, like maybe that was like self-preservation, but at that point, like the teenage girl at the door, yeah, I'm with him. And just keep going. Like we seem like you could have figured out a way not to betray the Lord there. We think, what a wimp. But for us, there is good news for us in Peter's failure. Because Jesus died for those who betrayed him. That was Peter, yes, but it's also you. And it's also me. We are those who have turned our backs on a good and loving God in our own sin. And he is the one who made a way by sending a faithful servant, his son, Jesus Christ, to die for our betrayal so we could be brought back to God. Jesus not only loves his betrayers, Jesus is going to die for his betrayers. As we conclude, well, there's some things we can take practically from this. I think the first thing we should do is behold the love of God. that even in this moments of unfaithfulness all around him, some of you in your life, if you're honest, you are surrounded with unfaithfulness. Maybe some of you it's been a spouse, some of you it's been kids, some of you it's been relationships, some of you it's been a boss that's just, you're just surrounded by unfaithfulness. You can watch as Jesus is surrounded by those who betray him, and yet he is faithful. So though you are surrounded by those who would betray you and lie to you and deceive you and hurt you, there is one who never will, and that is Jesus Christ. Behold the love of God. Secondly, don't be ashamed. In this text, we see a phrase 2 times, and I think it's a big deal. It's the principle of association. Like, who are you with? We see it with Judas in verse number 5. It says, Judas, who betrayed him, was standing with them. I don't know if you ever had a moment on the playground as a kid where somebody drew a line in the dirt, said, pick your side, right? We're going to have an all-out brawl, which usually just involves falling on top of each other in the dirt for a little while, right? Which side are you on? We see twice. Judas picked the side of the band. Peter, verse 18, was also with them, standing and warming himself, picking his side. Do not be ashamed to be identified with Christ. There will be moments where someone's going to ask you, hey, don't you go to church? Hey, or don't you, do you believe all this Jesus stuff? Like, we're getting to the political cycle next year when people are like extra bold. Like, we just like to ask people personal questions next year. When like, hey, you don't believe that, do you? What are we going to do? Can I encourage you, don't be ashamed to identify with Christ, because he went through betrayal after betrayal after betrayal. For what reason? To be identified with you. So behold his love. Do not be ashamed, okay, to identify yourself with him. And lastly, we should worship him. Doing all of this for us, doing all of this for our opportunity to have a relationship with him. Jesus, surrounded by unfaithfulness. Jesus faithfully followed God's saving plan despite being surrounded by unfaithfulness around him, and actually in order to save the unfaithful people who were betraying him. I know many of us in this room have dealt with betrayal. Some of you severe, some of you think, oh, it hasn't been that bad, but it stings regardless of it. Can I encourage you, though you've been betrayed by your friends, they've been betrayed by religious systems, by leaders, by pastors, they've been betrayed socially. Can I encourage you, Jesus never will. Jesus is right there beside you. But you need to, first of all, not only forgive those who betrayed you, but realize in your own situation, you have betrayed Christ and are in need of forgiveness. And ask yourself the question, have I been forgiven of my own betrayal of God? Have I accepted his offering of salvation? Have I accepted his forgiveness for my betrayal of him when I chose to not associate with him, instead to associate with my own sin? Let's have a word of prayer together.